welcome back to the Mother-Daughter Disney podcast. My name is Amanda. I'm here with my lovely mother.
Hi, I'm Janette.
And today we're going to go over the golden era, which is it's the first Disney movie era. So a few weeks ago, or at this point a few months ago, we did a podcast episode just in general on the Disney movie eras. And then we thought it's like, let's do a deep dive into all of the movie eras. I thought that'd be fun. So of course, we're starting off with the golden era. So that's super fun. So the golden era, it's funny, we actually just saw the live action Snow White. So in order of recording this, we're going to have a few episodes between this one and the Snow White one, but we're going back to the golden era now. Okay. So, all right. So the golden era is officially between 1937 to 1942. And this marks the first movie era for Disney in a general sense. So in this era, we have Snow White, which is 1937, Pinocchio, 1940, Fantasia, 1940, Dumbo, 1941, and Bambi, 1942. The basis of this era was stories based on old children's tales that have some dark, serious scenes along with like the bright, happy scenes as well. So all these movies kind of contrast those two types of scenes in them. So where did the ideas of the feature films come from? So when I first just say Disney, I'm just talking about Walt Disney. I debated either calling him Walt or Disney, and I wasn't really sure. So for the most part, I'm just going to call Walt Disney, but that's who I'm usually going to be talking about is Walt Disney himself. So Disney first had the idea in 1933 with the Silly Symphonies series. The Silly Symphonies were rarely successful, but Disney didn't actually see them as profitable as they could be. And he also thought there was much more storytelling possibilities with the full-length feature films. So after the success of The Three Little Pigs in 1933.
Oh, wow. I remember that one.
Yes, Disney was very set on doing his first feature film. He actually wanted, what do you think he actually wanted the first feature film to be? Do you have a guess? A hint is that he eventually did do this movie.
He did?
Yeah, not in this era, but he did do it eventually.
No, doesn't come to mind.
So the first film he wanted to do was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland.
Oh, okay.
But this
makes sense. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But this was actually scrapped because Paramount Pictures at the time in the 1930s was already working on their own version of this.
Oh.
So Paramount Pictures actually did like a live action version, and you can still go find that movie today if you wanted to watch it.
I don't even know where that, I don't remember that one at all.
So Disney also considered Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, but he actually couldn't get the rights to this, so he couldn't do that. Then other stories he considered was Bambi, but Disney wasn't sure if their animation studio was ready for the technical challenges of Bambi yet, so it wasn't Bambi. And he also considered The Odyssey and Gulliver's Travels as well. But eventually in 1934, Disney settled on Snow White to be the first film. So he had actually seen the 1916 silent film when he was a teenager. I remembered loving the storyline and all the details that had within it. He felt like it kind of had everything. It had the prince and the princess, it had romance, it had sympathetic characters, it had drama. Just saying, you know what, this one's going to be our first one. And many of the animators were initially a little bit nervous for this project as they weren't sure an audience would be interested in an animated movie. Because again, at this time, we just went from silent films, like adding music to films. No one's ever seen like an animated feature film like this before. They were also concerned that the colors would hurt people's eyes and that people would only watch the anime, like people really only watch animations for like a quick laugh, right? Like these things were only like 5 to 10 minutes long at the most. You're kind of there for a quick laugh. Yeah. So they're saying like, how would an animated story sustain an audience's attention? So a lot of people were really against Disney saying like, you shouldn't be doing this. And even Disney's own wife, Liliana, and his brother, Roy, who was his business partner, of course, tried to talk him out of doing Snow White, but Disney was like, nope, we're going to go ahead with this. We're doing it.
And hence, this is why Walt Disney was a genius.
Disney really thought that a solid story with both like comedy and tragedy would hold an audience's attention. So the initial budget for this movie was $250,000, which was 10 times the budget of any of the other Silly Symphonies. And there were many different ideas and manuscripts written for Snow White, as Disney said that at the time, nothing was off the table, right? Because this is their first one. It's like, whatever ideas we have, we're going to do. So some of the ideas they had initially was that Snow White in one draft was actually much more tomboyish and the queen was much more feminine. And then they end up changing that, of course. The queen at one point too is also supposed to be like kind of like fat and, you know, like fat and happy type of thing. And then they're like, no, we want her to be more regal and elegant instead. They also had an idea where the prince would be imprisoned in the castle and he would have to fight his way out, which is funny enough. That's kind of what they do in the live action film, that Jonathan gets captured and fights his way out. Right. Some of the original names for the dwarves were Wheezy, Jumpy, Baldy, Grumpy, Happy, Doc, and Sleepy. So as we know, Wheezy, Jumpy, and Baldy did not make it. So
I'm glad Baldy didn't make it.
I know. And so other names that they also considered as well was Hickey, Sniffy, Stuffy, Shorty, Burpy, Tubby, Dizzy, and then Dopey. And Dopey, of course, did stay.
Right.
So I think some of these are really funny. Obviously, Wheezy became Sneezy instead. I'm not really sure who. I think Jumpy was kind of funny. And I think Baldy would have been so funny. Can you imagine if they kept Baldy?
Oh, God.
And what I think is also
They wouldn't
funny.
be able to wear a cap.
Well, also in the 1937 version, all of them are bald. So it's like, I don't know how they would have done Baldy when all of them were bald, you know?
Right.
So the animation team went to, and they also, one of the main elements that they really kept from the original storyline was the poison apple. So there were a couple different things in the original storyline that they toyed with keeping or not keeping, but the big thing they wanted to keep was the poison apple. So the animation team went to weekly art classes with live models to draw like how the human body moved. And while most of the animation was hand drawn, almost like all of it was hand drawn, there were a few scenes with Snow White and the Prince specifically that was traced from live action footage and then translated into animation. So Disney actually, so again, let's remember, his wife and his business partner were like, don't do this. This is like a horrible waste of time. This is going to flop. To the point eventually where Disney had to mortgage his house to help finance the film's productions. Can you imagine that your wife is telling you, don't do this project? And he's like, I'm going to mortgage my house.
She was a very trusting woman.
The eventual total cost of Snow White ended up being almost $1.5 million, which was a massive sum in 1937. And in present day, if you count for inflation, so again, 1.5 million. Today, that would be about $33.6 million. And to reference, $33.6 million for the original Snow White, Moana 2 had a budget of $150 million. So it was still way less than what current movies today cost.
Still back then, that was
For
lots
sure, yeah,
of money.
1.5 million. And again, midway through, Disney needed another loan of $250,000. So he ended up, which is $5.6 million today, of a loan to finish the film. And so he kind of went through to few different banks, and a lot of them were like, nope, we're not going to give you that money. But eventually, Joseph Rosenberg at the Bank of America, he kind of sat down and watched part of the showing of Snow White, of what they had so far. And he actually loved Snow White so much that he was like, you know what, I'm going to give you the loan. So he gave Disney the last loan that he needed. And again, it was all worth it because the film was an absolute success, and it earned over $7.8 million in 1937, which today is $177.5 million worldwide, so internationally as well. So critics also highly praised the movie, and Disney was awarded an Academy Honorary Award for the film as well. So it all paid off in the end. After the success of Snow White, Disney and the animation studio were real excited now to work on their next film. They're like, this can be successful, we got to do it. So the next film set was actually going to be Bambi. But again, the animation studio was having a hard time realistically animating the animals that were in Bambi, and it just continued to be a technical challenge, specifically the deer themselves. And since the deer was the main animal, they weren't basically ready to do it. So instead, Disney gave the go-ahead for Pinocchio to be the next full-length feature film, and he said Bambi would be the third. So Disney thought, because Bambi was not the third, it was the fifth. So Pinocchio was based on the 1883 Italian children's novel, The Adventures of Pinocchio, with a very fixed storyline, because before a fairy tale is pretty short overall, so they kind of had a lot of loosey-goosey things they could kind of do with it, where Pinocchio was more of like children's novel, so it had a very fixed storyline, very fixed characters and things that happen in the book. And because the original Pinocchio is much darker, especially in the sense that in a lot of the Italian children's tales, they were all meant to teach children lessons the very hard way, like you're learning the hard way and you're learning no way at all. So Disney writers wanted to modernize the character and make it a bit brighter in their animation. So the original animation of Pinocchio was much closer to his original drawings of a wooden puppet. Disney absolutely hated it. He hated all the original animations of it, and he told the animators to forget the fact that Pinocchio was a puppet and to focus on making him a cute little boy and then draw the wooden joints and the other like wooden features of a puppet in after the fact. And again, I feel like this is another good example of Disney having that forward thinking to the target audience.
He just knew what to do.
Yeah, he knew this movie was for American families and kids who wanted a feel-good movie with the sympathetic characters that they can root for, where the protagonist wins in the end but still learns like hard lessons along the way. So you got to make the animation of the characters still look pleasing to the eye, so to speak, and not too scary essentially. So to animate the movie, animators drew inspiration from models of characters, where they would move the characters almost like stop motion, as well as through some live action footage, but they mainly did a lot of models for characters for this one too, which kind of makes sense if you think about, like, again, Pinocchio was a puppet at the end of the day. Pinocchio was well known and praised for its advanced effects animations. So this is specifically basically everything other than the characters themselves. So like the Blue Fairy's wand animations, the rain, the lighting, the shadows, the movement of the water, and that specifically that water animation. The water animation itself was extremely innovative at the time, and it was one of the first realistic animations of water moving for its time in the 1940s. So before then, no one had really seen water move like this, so they kind of figured it out with this movie, which is really great. Pinocchio was released in February 1940 and was actually considered a box office failure. It completely flopped in the box office. The movie cost around $2.6 million, which in today's money is $59.2 million, and it was twice the cost of Snow White. Broadway and only made around $1 million or $22.7 million by the late 1940s. And of course, if you look at your world history, this was mainly due to the fact that they could not run the movie internationally due to World War II. So World War II started in September of 1939, and this movie came out in the early 1940s. And as the US at the time was still trying to remain neutral in the war, the movie could not be distributed to European or Asian markets. And let's remember, Pinocchio is based off an Italian book, which means they could not even market the movie to an Italian audience, where people who actually knew the book would want to maybe see the movie.
Actually see the movie.
So Disney was reportedly very, very depressed about Pinocchio's initial run. I'm sure if you think about it too, it's like Snow White was such an amazing, success, and then for your next film to be such a flop. But also, again, like partially not your fault. It's like, again, you couldn't run it internationally, but you still feel a failure. But again, it wasn't all that sad because Pinocchio was the first Disney film to be nominated and win an Academy Award. It won for Best Original Score, and it also won for Best Original Song for When You Wish Upon a Song. So I mean, like, it still did get accolades, which I think proves to the success that Pinocchio could be successful.
It could have been successful. Well, it's been successful over the years.
And again, Pinocchio was much more successful in its second theatrical run in 1945. And after a few more theatrical runs throughout the year, the movie did eventually turn profitable. I feel like now is a good time to point out, I'm obviously not going over every single detail of this movie because we'd be here for 10 years.
We'd be here for another 5 hours.
We're just doing the summary. I will put my sources, of course, in the description, and I would definitely recommend going to read more about this, especially now as we're getting into Disney's third feature-length film, which was Fantasia. So Fantasia consists of 8 animated segments set to pieces of classical music conducted by Leopold Stokowski. I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong, so I'm so sorry to Leopold Stokowski. So Disney decided to turn these 8 segments into a movie with the completion of The Sorcerer's Apprentice. The Sorcerer's Apprentice was originally going to be a silly symphony cartoon as designed for a comeback from Mickey Mouse, because at the time Mickey Mouse was declining in popularity, and that was due to the rise of Looney Tunes. So like Bugs Bunny and Woody the Woodpecker were kind of rising in popularity. Mickey was going down in popularity. And even at the time, Goofy and Donald were more popular than Mickey at the time. So The Sorcerer's Apprentice was initially created for Mickey to kind of have his big comeback. But The Sorcerer's Apprentice production costs kept getting higher and higher, and the return on investment was just not going to be possible for The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So it was time for them to turn it into a feature-length film. Essentially, Disney was like, well, let's just change their trajectory here so that Sorcerer's Apprentice will be successful. So the 8 segments I'm just going to briefly go through the 8 segments because they all have their own storyline. So again, we'd be here forever if we deep dive into all of them. You could do a whole episode on Fantasia, honestly. Like the depth into Fantasia is honestly fascinating.
Fantasia's amazing.
It is. So the first segment is Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Jonathan Sebastian Bach. And this is just This is just abstract patterns and shapes that are sort of moving to the music. The next is the Nutcracker Suite by Pyotr Tchaikovsky. So this one has animations of fairies and flowers and fish and other wildlife dancing to the music. Then we have The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Paul Dukas, which is Mickey Mouse attempting to perform some of his master's tricks. The next one is The Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, which tells the story of Earth's beginnings and the formation of its first living creatures, basically then up to the dinosaurs. There's then an intermission, which I thought was kind of funny, with the orchestra members being spotlighted, essentially. The next segment is the Pastoral Symphony by Ludwig Beethoven, and this features Greek mythological characters as they're gathering for a festival when Zeus interrupts the festival. That's a very short summary of what this one is. It gets very in-depth for that one. The next one is Dance of the Hours by Amilcare Ponchielli, and this is a comic ballet told in 4 sections depicting the passing of time. So it's like the early morning, day, afternoon, nighttime, and all the animals are performing ballet. And if you've ever seen the hippo doing the ballet before,
that's all you think of when you think of that.
Yeah, that's where this one is from. Tutu. Yeah, the famous hippo doing ballet. Yes. And then the last segment is Night on the Bald Mountain by Modest Moskowski and Ava Maria by Franz Schubert. And this tells the story of evil spirits being awakened in the night. Again, that's another very, very short description of what that segment is. So Disney wanted a well-known conductor to work with him on The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and he met Leopold Stokowski in 1937, who was the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra at the time. And at the time, the Philadelphia Orchestra was one of the most renowned orchestras in the United States and almost in the world as well to a certain extent. Stokowski loved the idea of The Sorcerer's Apprentice so much, he actually offered to do it for Disney for completely free. He was like, you don't even have to pay me, you just have to pay the orchestra, essentially, because he just loved it and wanted to be a part of the project. So The Sorcerer's Apprentice cost over $125,000, which today would be $2.8 million. And again, Roy Disney told Walt, we'll never make the money back from this. We will never financially recover from The Sorcerer's Apprentice. So Disney came up with the idea to group separate numbers together to form a single presentation like a concert. And he really loved this idea of like forming this concert type movie. He also hired Deems Taylor to help create the music for what they were calling the concert feature at the time. There was a lot of back and forth over the music choices voice at first, and Disney also admitted too that he wasn't really like a classic musical expert or anything like that. So he was kind of just there for the vibes, kind of like helping the team based on the vibes. And Disney was actually said to be more enthusiastic about this project, but he was more anxious over Pinocchio. I think a lot of things were kind of going wrong with Pinocchio,
right?
Where this one was kind of like the fun project, so to speak. So in animation, so like Pinocchio, they created clay models of the characters who'd feature in the film, so they could study the models from all different angles. And they also did some of the live action scenes as well, where they kind of traced over them. The big, I would say, the big innovative thing for Fantasia is that they created a multi-plane camera that could handle 7 layers of color, which is more than the traditional 3 layers other animations had, specifically for this movie. So this camera was made just for this movie. The movie was also known for recording audio on multiple audio channels called Fantasia, which Disney invented, which would eventually lead to what we know now as surround sound. So again, the way they record the sound and the way that they did the animation was completely innovative for its time. And with the failure of Pinocchio in February, Fantasia came out in November of 1940, and initially as a theatrical sideshow, because again, they kind of saw Pinocchio flopped, so they're like, well, let's set Fantasia up for success. And Fantasia basically made no money either. So it earned even less than Pinocchio made. And at the time, Europe made up 44% of film profits and like from US like Hollywood movies. So again, World War II was still going on. We're still only within like the first year of World War II. And the film didn't even start making a profit until 1969. And this was after multiple re-releases into the theaters. So they re-released into theaters multiple times.
I saw it when they re-released it in the theater.
Yeah. And so it was actually in the 1960s where it actually started to pick up a lot of traction. And that is because they changed a new marketing campaign. In the 1960s, they used a psychedelic advertising campaign with lots of colors, and the movie became popular amongst young audiences who appreciated its colorful experience that was almost like basically being on like a drug-infused type of experience. So that's how they marketed. Great marketing campaign, honestly. Good idea for them.
They read the room.
So that's what I'm saying. So despite many setbacks of the film, as well as with many, apparently there were a lot of issues restoring the film itself, because again, a lot of times when we see these older films, like the remastered version is what it's called.
To be remastered.
Yeah, they essentially kind of have to like redo it almost to a certain extent. And apparently there was a lot of issues with the film itself of them having to fix it, like the graininess in it, like scratches within the film itself and everything. So they had lots of issues with the setbacks in the film and with the film itself. But Fantasia still currently sits as the 23rd highest grossing film of all time in the US when adjusting for inflation. Do you know what the first highest grossing film in the US is, adjusting for inflation? No, I think Titanic was like 5. Oh. The first one was Gone with the Wind, which is crazy.
Oh.
Yeah, if you think about that came out in the 1930s too. To this day, that's still the highest grossing film when you adjust for inflation. It was Gone with the Wind.
People I saw that in the movies too, so obviously when it was
people
when I was
really,
a lot older.
Yeah, people really love Gone with the Wind, which is, I don't think I've ever seen Gone with the Wind. So
it's very long.
It is.
Very long. It's like a 3 hour, and at the time it was very
3
long.
hours, yeah, in the 1930s.
Yeah, back then, it's a very long movie.
No, that makes sense. Well, now at this point, Disney has just lost greatly financially on Pinocchio and Fantasia. They basically made no money 2 movies back to back. So in 1941, Dumbo was deliberately produced to recoup the financial losses of Pinocchio and Fantasia. Dumbo was based on a children's story written by Helen Aberson Mayer and Harold Pearl, and Disney's head of merchandising, Kay Kamen, first introduced Disney to Dumbo in 1939 in a roll book, which is basically like a merchandise type item that you could just sell. And Disney loved the idea of Dumbo so much in that book that he immediately just purchased the rights to it. He was like, one day we're going to turn this into something, and like, I want the rights to it. So with World War II still going on, Dumbo was intended to be a low budget feature film to bring revenue to the studio. That's all it was. They were like, we just need some money. We're making nothing right now. We got to recoup our losses. So with the goal of being simple and inexpensive, Dumbo has much more simple character designs, a lot less background paintings, and overall fewer frames in like the overall movie. I also want to note too that Dumbo is only about 60 minutes long, whereas Fantasia was almost 2 hours long.
Fantasia was another long movie.
Yeah, Fantasia was 2 hours, and Pinocchio and Snow White were 90 minutes each. So again, this one was much shorter in comparison. The backgrounds were done with watercolor, which was only used for Snow White and some other shorter cartoons, whereas other Disney films would use like oil paint and gouache, like a different type of paint. So again, they went to watercolor, which was a little bit less expensive as well. And Disney also moved his more experienced animators to Bambi and hired less experienced animators to work on Dumbo, and just had like people supervise them essentially, because again, they're trying to cut costs here. Right. They also wanted the movie to come out quickly, so to speed up production, they used story sketches instead of full layout artwork for the film as well. So like when they instead of doing like the full story sketches for the artwork of what the movie's going to be, they just, or like the layout artwork, they just did sketches to just speed up the overall process. So it was in 1941 that there was the big animator strike, and this is when a lot of the animators were demanding higher wages. There was a lot that goes into this animator animator strike, specifically with very specific people who are involved in the strike. So I'm not actually going to get too much into it right now. I think I'll actually get into it more in the next era, in the wartime era, because the repercussions of this strike actually hits the wartime era more so than it does this era, surprisingly. But this is where the strike started, though. So Dumbo was released in October of 1941 and was the most financially successful film during World War II. This was a financial miracle at the time. They were like, we're actually making money for once. So Dumbo cost around $950,000 or $21.6 million in today's money to produce. So it cost half the amount of money to produce Snow White and a third of what Pinocchio cost, but still grossed over $1.2 million of profit. And their profit ended up being $150,000, which in today's money is $19.3 million. So they did make some money with Dumbo, which is great to see. The movie overall had good reviews, but it was criticized for its depiction of Black people, as well as used for its crows as a reference as to reinforce African-American stereotypes. However, there are some people who do praise the crow characters as they represent a marginalized group of people, and being one of the few characters in Dumbo, they're actually sympathetic to Dumbo's struggles. People are like, actually, the crows are a better character. The set of crows, because there's like 5 of them, are actually better than some of these other characters in the movie. So, and Dumbo was animated at the Academy Awards for Best Scoring of a Musical Picture and won, and it was also nominated for Best Original Song for Baby Mine, but I don't think it won for Baby Mine. So now we are on to our final movie in the golden era, which was Bambi in 1942. Remember, this was supposed to be the first movie, and again, so many setbacks with Bambi.
That was actually the first Disney movie I saw in the movies.
Was Bambi?
Bambi.
So Bambi is based on the novel Bambi, A Life in the Woods by Felix Salten. So Sidney Franklin actually purchased the film rights right before Disney with the goal to create a live action film. And this was in 1933. So 1933, this guy was like, I'm going to make a live action Bambi, essentially. After he purchased the rights, everyone around him was like, actually, it's going to be impossible for you to do a live action film of Bambi. So and everyone told him maybe you should work with Walt Disney and do an animated film instead. So he was like, great idea. But then he eventually just sold the rights to Disney in 1937. So originally intended again to be the second feature film, the film was delayed for 2 major reasons. The first being animating realistic deer, and the other was that the original novel was written for an adult audience with much darker themes, and the writers were having a really hard time trying to lighten up the story, essentially. So the writing of Bambi went back and forth many times, and with many storylines and scenes scrapped. And literally their list goes on and on with how many scenes. So I have a few here that I thought were interesting. There was originally supposed to be an entire scene where Bambi steps on an anthill, and then like we see the destruction of the anthill. And apparently they actually animated the scene, and they were like, what are we doing this? This has nothing to do with Bambi. So they're like, let's not do this. At some point there were 6 bunnies, and eventually they were like, actually, let's just do 5 bunnies, with one bunny being a different color and having a more prominent role, and that eventually turned into Thumper. Bambi's mother was originally going to leap over a log and be shot in midair, but then they worried this would be too dramatic for a children's film.
It was dramatic already.
Well, her death scene is off screen essentially instead.
Yes, but it's still a death scene.
So
if I'm not mistaken, doesn't that start the movie?
It does not, no.
I thought it was the first scene in the movie.
It is not the first scene in the movie.
I haven't seen Bambi. I think. I didn't like Bambi.
Yeah,
I got to tell you.
It's not the first scene in the movie, but again, she was supposed to have a much more dramatic scene, but they thought it would be too dramatic, so they took that off. Disney himself actually also wanted the man, like the hunter, to be seen. So if you don't know the movie, because I'm assuming you don't remember the movie right now.
I don't remember most of it. I do remember that scene with the mother, though.
So at the end of the movie, the hunter sets the forest on fire inadvertently, like by accident, essentially, and they all kind of run away. And so Disney himself originally wanted the man to be seen burning alive in the fire at the end as an irony that he set the fire by accident and then he died in his own fire. Really... But then they scrapped this because they decided we actually don't see the man really at all in the film. You kind of see a silhouette in the background, but you actually don't see him specifically, so that got scrapped. There was also a chipmunk and squirrel comedic duo, but this was also scrapped because Disney really liked the idea of having like 3 main principal characters who end up being Bambi, Thumper, and Flower. So, all right, so animating the deer. So there are deer in Snow White, and I actually just recently rewatched the 1937 version of Snow White because while there are deer that were animated in Snow White, they were animated in Eric Larson, who was one of the main animators at the time, as, in quotes, big flour sacks. So he said that the deer were not animated that well in Snow White, which I thought was funny because when I rewatched, I'm like, I didn't think they were that bad. I thought they looked pretty good. They don't look anything like Bambi, that's for sure. Right. But it's like they weren't bad though. So they wanted the deer in Bambi to be as realistic and much more expressive as they possibly could be. So the animators actually worked with professional painters who were skilled in painting animals, as well as they set up a small zoo in their animation studio where they could study the movement of the animals as well. And they did do some live action references as well, even though there's actually no humans in the movie. But for instance, they did it for like staging scenes. So there's a scene where Bambi and Thumper are on like the ice pond. So they had humans help stage the scenes of like what they would be doing sort of on the ice pond for spacing and stuff. And when they were animating the background, they actually worked with a Chinese animator by Tyrus Wrong. Tyrus Wrong was skilled in creating backgrounds that were in a more impressionistic style. So originally the animators had a very detailed forest scene, but Disney was like, there's too much going in the scene. Like, we can't have all these details in the background. And so Tyrus Wrong was skilled at saying, and the impressionistic style of having more detail in the center of the background and then less towards the edges. Like the edges kind of fade out almost. So that way it kind of keeps the eyes on the characters themselves, who for the most part are kind of in the center of the screen. So Bambi was released in August of 1942 in London. And this was the first Disney film to premiere abroad. But again, the movie wasn't actually disseminated in Europe, funny enough. So it premiered in London, but it wasn't like disseminated in London or anything like that. And the movie's first release made about $1.6 million, which today would be $38.4 million. And it had a budget of $858,000, which was $19 million today.
Profit.
Yeah, so it still turned a profit even back then, which is pretty good. But like Fantasia, the movie turned an even greater profit in its re-releases, and its profits really exceeded the expectations of what they thought Bambi could do again in the 1960s. Like, I feel like the 1960s was the big year.
1960s, because that's when I started.
It was a booming time in the 1960s.
I was old enough to go to the movies, and we went to the movies. And Bambi was the first one I saw.
So at the time when Bambi came out, critics thought the movie they thought the movie was more fantastical than Disney's other previous films, and the movie was nominated at the Academy Awards for Best Scoring of a Dramatic Comedy Picture, Best Original Song for Love Is a Song, and Best Sound Recording, but it didn't win in any of these categories. And then that actually technically concludes the golden era, because then we move into the wartime era. And so with Bambi concluding the wartime era, again, now we're like going fully into the midst of World War II going next. So that is going to be in our next episode of this movie eras. But I do have some fun facts here that I felt like didn't fit in within the overall storyline. So first up, Adriana Castellati was the first casting in the golden era as Snow White. She was called in to record for 44 days in recording sessions over a span of 2 years, and she received $20 each day when she came in. Wow. So Castellati was paid $970, to be Snow White, essentially the first Disney princess, which in today's money would be just under $22,000 to be the first Disney princess.
To be Snow White.
It was proved very, very difficult at the time to add color to Snow White's and the evil queen's faces. So they had a trouble like actually animating their faces and adding the proper color to them. Eventually they found a red dye that worked well enough, but it had to be added with a small piece of cotton wrapped around a tipple pencil on each individual cell. And this method was so time consuming that it was literally never done again at the same scale. They used it a little bit in Pinocchio and a little bit in Fantasia, but the main animator who did this, she left the studio in 1941, and they literally had no one else who could replace her skills, so they just never did it again. Disney felt that in early scripts of Pinocchio was too helpless and easily deceived, and he wanted a character who would help guide Pinocchio to be making right decisions, and this ended up being Jiminy Cricket. So the main animator for Jiminy Cricket was Ward Kimball, and he came up with his design of Jiminy Cricket as a little man with an egg head and no ears, and he said Jiminy was a cricket because we call him a cricket, which I think is so funny, because it's true. If you look at Jiminy Cricket, he doesn't really look like a cricket at all. He just kind of looks like a little man character, in a suit. But we call him a cricket, so therefore he has become a cricket. So RKO Radio Production Pictures was the distributor for all of these films at the time. They thought Dumbo was too short to release as a feature film, and they really wanted Disney to add 10 more minutes to Dumbo. They were like, in 1 hour for a feature film is way too short. All these other movies, Gone with the Wind was 3 hours long, right?
3 hours.
So here we have this 1 hour little, this little animated film. So they were like, no, you need to at least add 10 more minutes to it. But Disney told them, he was like, no, like the story is complete within its time frame that we have. And he said, you can't stretch things too far, they won't hold. But also secretly, adding another 10 minutes would cost about $500,000 or $11.3 million in today's money, and they just didn't have the budget for it.
Right.
So
we don't have the money.
They were not adding any more to Dumbo. And also in the original book, Bambi was a roe deer, and this is a species native to Europe, and that's because the original Bambi book was written in Europe. So of course Bambi was a European deer, and Disney really wanted the deer Bambi to be changed to a mule deer that is located mainly in Arrowhead, California, or in Northern California. But one of the main illustrators working on Bambi convinced Disney that a mule deer had very large mule-like ears, and he said they didn't really look like a deer and wouldn't be very recognizable in most of America. And he's the one that convinced Disney to change Bambi from a mule deer to a white-tailed deer, since that would be more recognizable.
Everybody
in the
knows
United
white-tailed
States.
deer, right?
Which I think does make sense. I think if Bambi was the mule deer, we probably would just recognize it as a deer, since that's what we watched in a famous movie type of thing. Right. But I think the white-tailed deer does make more sense overall. So but that is the fun facts that I had for that. So I realized I was so many notes and so much talking just for the golden era. And again, there is
It's
so
only
much.
4 movies.
5 movies. But yeah,
five.
there is so much more that goes into depth for all of these movies. Like if you really jump into the background of like how each movie was
Each
made,
one.
all the people who worked on it, there's a lot of depth to it. So I definitely would suggest looking up some of these things if you're interested in, especially for Snow White, since it was the first movie. So there was a lot of, politics and back and forth that kind of happened with that movie, especially. But again, I feel like that movie is just so infamous now since it was the first Disney feature-length film, it was the first Disney princess. It kind of started a lot of things for animated
Because a lot
films
of times
in
when you see
general.
these movies, you don't think about what went into them. You know that they're being made. You know that somebody's drawing them and doing whatever. But you don't really know all the stuff that goes on of what's happening.
Yeah,
in
like the
in
time it
back
really
scenes.
takes and-
the time, the people, the
Technical
status.
challenges.
The challenges of trying to do what they need to do, like you said, that having to get a red dye on a piece of cotton, onto something else, to do every cell, to do. You don't realize how much goes into all that.
Yeah, no, for sure.
You sit and watch the movie and go, "Wow, that was good."
I know, but this is really fun actually to look up because I didn't really know a lot about any of these movies, honestly. This is the era where I have seen all 5 of these movies. Some of them I haven't, like I've watched Snow White the most recently and then Bambi probably the second most recently. But yeah, but I do love all these movies. I think they're all pretty good overall and they stand the test of time. So the next era is going to be the wartime era. And that is the era where I don't think I've seen any of the movies.
Oh, wow.
So,
Okay.
yes, I'm really
That should be
excited for the
interesting.
wartime era because I haven't really seen any of those movies. I think it'll be interesting because there's a lot more politics to that era because of World War II, of course.
I mean, I'll be interested to see what they are. Okay.
Yeah, World War II is definitely, of course it changed the whole world. The whole world was shaped differently after the Second World War. So yeah, but excited to go over that in the future. But for now, we are going to some Disney news, but we're actually not going to do any Disney news because this episode is so pre-recorded that it's not really worth doing any Disney news.
We both have a very busy life.
But instead, we'll do some Disney birthdays. On April 15th is Huey, Dewey, and Louie's birthday, Donald's nephew. So happy birthday to Huey and Dewey and Louie. Also on April 15th in 1983, Disneyland Tokyo opened. So Disneyland Tokyo is having an anniversary this year. And April 15th was also my childhood cat's Brooklyn and China's birthday as well. A lot on April 15th, the big day. It's also tax day as well in the United
Tax
States.
day, right.
So, and then on April 20th, it is Easter. So happy Easter to all who celebrate as well. And that leads us to our final segment of the podcast, our Disney memory. Do you have a Disney memory for
My
this
Disney memory is
podcast?
Bambi.
Bambi, seeing Bambi in theaters.
As soon as you started talking about the golden era and you named the movie Bambi, of all of the stuff that went on in Bambi, all the cute little things with Thumper and blah, and Flower and blah, everything. The only thing I remember about Bambi was being so upset about the scene where his mother dies.
Yeah.
And that's why I never watched it again.
Yeah, it's very sad. I have seen it, of course, as well, too.
I don't remember
It is a
how
very
old I
sad
was when I
scene.
saw it. It obviously was in the 60s, so I was probably only about 7 years old. I was born in the 50s. But I was young, but I remember it being the first Disney movie I saw in the movies. I did see other movies before that one. But it was the first Disney movie that I actually went to see in the movies, and I was so floored by that scene that I just never watched it again.
Yes, I believe she gets shot off screen, but then Bambi finds her afterwards, is what it is. So that's
I
probably what
remember
we
the
would've
fire.
seen.
I remember
Yeah.
the
fires at the very end,
I just
yeah.
remember the bad stuff about Bambi for some reason. Some reason that movie just did not hit me well, and I just
'cause it's very
discounted
sad.
it.
Yeah,
Yes, I just
very
discounted
sad.
it. And I can usually take sad with the good and say I don't like sad. I
Well,
get
to
very
a certain extent, all these movies have sadness in them.
that's what I
right?
said. They all have some kind of
Snow White's
tragedy
stepmother was
and-
trying to
yes.
kill her. Pinocchio, was being swindled by
everybody,
John
right.
Fox.
Yes.
Fantasia was a bunch of short stories, so it's a little bit different. Dumbo was being heavily bullied. His mother
Right.
was bullied so hard. she
Ariel
got-
gets her voice taken away, even when you get to the new ones.
Wait,
and Nemo
only
gets
in
lost.
Wait, hold on. We're only focused on Golden Era right now.
you're only on the
But that's what
Golden
I'm saying,
Era.
though. So yeah, so Dumbo is heavily bullied, and his mother is so heavily bullied, she gets put basically in prison, in
Right.
elephant prison.
Right, they were sad.
And then obviously Bambi has to go through the struggles of living in the wildlife. So as I'm saying, yeah. So this era, but I mean, like that's why this era is like told in this way, where it has like these serious, very serious, dark scenes that contrast the very bright and happy scenes
brightness,
as well.
right. But like I said,
So they
every-
all have very bright scenes
Right.
too.
A lot of the movies do that along the way. But like I said, Bambi hit me the most. And that's when you started talking, my memory immediately went to Bambi and said, that's why I never watched it again.
But so overall, yeah, I do like these movies. I think this was like a good era kind of to first start off like the movie era for all of Disney. And I think it makes sense too, because like you said as well, it kind of sets the stage for a lot of like other movies that are going to be told in the future. And just in general, I think for like movie telling as well, for animated movies and for other
everything,
Disney
movie
movies.
telling, the
So-
animation, the everything that it caused going forward. He pushed, like you said, when you were doing your report, he pushed. People were telling him, don't do it, don't do it. It's not worth it, don't do it. And he just kept pushing. So if he hadn't pushed, where would all that animation have, come from?
Well, yeah, well, that's even when you think about the parks too, because this predates the parks, like the Disneyland in California didn't
Right.
open until 1955. So all these movies came out way before the park was
parks.
even opened. So that's kind of amazing too to see, like, again, the innovation that he did have to say
Right.
it's like, we're going to do an animation studio, we're going to do feature length animated films, we're going to open up a theme park.
Right. And no matter what anybody told him, he just kept going.
I know, like, think think about like what your business partners being like, oh my God, another crazy idea from my brother.
Idea. This man's out of his mind. We got to borrow this money. How are we going to get the money? And he just kept pushing no matter what. Yeah. He just kept picking himself up and doing it again.
That's not to say they didn't have their flops, of course, but it's like, I think it just speaks to the innovation.
I think it's amazing.
Like the collaboration that you kind of have, the foresight. So
the history is just amazing.
Well, I'm really excited to do the wartime era in the future. So we'll definitely have an episode on that probably over the summer at some point. Okay. But for now, let us know on our Instagram, Almost a Minute X, what you think of the golden era. Which of these 5 movies is your favorite? Do you ever rewatch any of these movies? Do you prefer the live action movies of these movies now? Since at this point, they all basically have live action counterparts to it, except for Bambi and for Fantasia. I don't think Fantasia is a live action.
Fantasia can't have a live.
But Snow White
could technically, but
Snow White, Dumbo, and Pinocchio have live action versions. Pinocchio has many live action versions actually.
Pinocchio was not one of my favorite.
Yeah, Pinocchio
movies.
has multiple different versions, live action versions of the movie, especially too because Pinocchio, again, the book came out so long ago. Any film can really kind of take over and do their own version of Pinocchio.
Book.
Yeah, so we'd love to know your thoughts. Which one's your favorite? Which storyline is your favorite? Do you prefer maybe the books, like the source material, because they're all based on books? Which one do you like better? Are you really a big fan of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which again was like basically made into Fantasia?
I love that live version. Talk about a live version when they did that one. I really like that live version movie.
Yeah, so we'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or leave a comment on our YouTube channel as well. But until then, we'll see you.